Chapter 5. Beneficial Sacrifices. He tried as hard as he could to swerve out of the way, but it was too late. The enormous hand came down on him with such force that it actually broke her hand. Peter's face went pale, and tears rolled down his face. Ronan looked down to see what was happening. As soon as he saw it, he screamed in terror. "You'll pay!" Before he knew it, Ronan's vision went blurry and rose-red. There was a loud flash, and his lunar necklace began to glow, and he slowly began to hover up until he was flying. Suddenly he was engulfed in crimson-red flames, and beams of it shot out of his arms and eyes and mouth. His scream was so loud that everyone else covered their ears and closed their eyes. When the fire reached old Betty, she let out a cry so deafening that the Colosseum itself began to crack, and the dust of the walls flew into everyone's eyes. Her skin began to melt and spark, shining so brightly that you would surely be blinded if you were to look into the center of it. Eventually he stopped, and his body felt weak. This resulted in him plummeting towards the ground. Crash! Peter ran over to him and leant cautiously over his body. Slowly, Ronan's eyelids opened. "It's all up to you now, Pete. Don't let us down," he managed, his voice coarse and rough. Nodding, Peter stood up and looked into the eyes of the kaiju. "You will die." He suddenly clambered onto the NASA Express and sprinted for the cockpit, pushing and shoving NASA agents out of the way. At this point he was crying so heavily that it looked as if water were leaking in the corridors. Finally, he reached the cockpit, not at all ready for what he knew he had to do. He looked silently at the buttons and took one deep breath. "Here we go," he murmured. A loud, stirring noise charged up. It was the thrusters. There was no going back now. This is NASA Express." The ship began to fly full speed towards her. Peter let out last two words. NASA Express. There was such an explosion that the entire arena blew up into millions of pieces, rocks flying everywhere. Back at the ship, Kola looked at the distant detonation, and she smiled. She knew they had won. She clambered back onto the ship, heading for Earth. One day, while enjoying some lunch in her house, she could have sworn she heard the three of them talking in the kitchen, but when she went in, she was to be faced with an empty room. It was a different day that they were there. She could prove it. At their funeral, she saw three faces looking at her through the window. Sure she was not hallucinating, she went outside. Nothing. But deep down, she knew they were still there.